Hey guys, tonight we're tucking ourselves beneath a woolen blanket in a candlelit stone chamber, where the air smells faintly of smoke, lavender, and maybe a little anxiety. Outside, oxen grunt softly. Somewhere in the rafters, a rat dreams of bread. But you're standing awkwardly beside your new spouse, whom you barely know, your face flushed, and your heart thumping like a blacksmith's hammer. You've just gotten married. Congratulations, you're 15, and you probably won't survive this, not emotionally anyway. Because in the medieval world, sex wasn't the end of a love story. It was more like the middle of a land dispute. Romance? Optional. Inheritance? Absolutely essential. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from, and what time is it over there? Drop your location and local time in the comments, so we can see how far this sleepy tale stretches. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You fidget in your wedding clothes, wool, tight in all the wrong places, and slightly itchy, and glance over at your new spouse. They look equally overwhelmed. You're not alone. That's the point. In this time, marriage wasn't about feelings. It was about land, alliances, status, and babies, preferably lots of them. Sex was the instrument of lineage, not longing. If you're a peasant, your marriage may have been arranged by your family or negotiated between fathers over a sheep and a cask of ale. If you're noble, it's worse. The entire union was likely engineered by ambitious relatives when you were still losing baby teeth. The age of marriage? Surprisingly young. Girls might be betrothed at 12 and married by 14, boys a bit older. And yes, this was legal and common, though the church technically preferred consummation to wait until puberty. Historians still argue whether most couples actually waited. The reality? It depended on the family, the region, the priest, and whether someone had a vested interest in speeding things along. You hear the priest outside giving a final blessing. The wedding was performed on church steps, as was custom, with the whole village in attendance. Public vows, a handshake, maybe a symbolic passing of dowry goods, and boom, you're hitched. What comes after is, well, everyone knows. Sex, for newlyweds, was expected immediately. Not because anyone particularly wanted it, but because consummation equals proof. Without it, the marriage could be annulled. And if you're nobility, there are witnesses. No, really. In some households, older relatives or stewards would wait outside the door, or even stay in the room, to ensure the union was sealed. You lie in bed, hoping they at least brought snacks. Unfringed tidbit. There's a documented case of a bishop actually blessing the marriage bed before the couple lay in it, complete with holy water, candles, and a very awkward silence. But let's back up a bit. For most of your life, sex has been explained to you in terms of morality and duty. The church has opinions, many. Sex is only allowed within marriage, only for procreation, and only, according to most clerical writers, without enjoyment. That's right. Pleasure was seen as dangerous, even sinful. But more on that later. Tonight, you just know that you're expected to do something you've barely been told how to do, with someone you might have met last Tuesday, while half the village exchanges bets about whether you'll do it properly. No pressure. The wedding feast was cheerful. Roast goose, maybe. Ale flowing. Songs were sung, toasts were made, and a few guests whispered scandalous tips behind their mugs. "Don't forget to say a prayer first," someone muttered. Another added, "Try not to smile too much, they'll think you liked it." Because here's the thing, Desire was complicated. Too much of it? Suspicious. Too little? Grounds for annulment. But we'll get there. You climb into bed, which is honestly just a rope frame with a thin mattress, slightly damp from the earlier rain. Your spouse joins you. The door shuts. The room quiets. And now, what? There's no manual, no helpful diagrams, no cozy chat about feelings. Just nervous glances and centuries of expectations pressing down like the low-hanging beams overhead. You remember what the midwife said, something about lying still and thinking holy thoughts, and that it shouldn't last too long if you both do it decently. Not the most reassuring guidance. Sex in this time isn't framed as fun or mutual or curious. It's functional. You do it to make heirs, to seal contracts, to earn legitimacy. A noblewoman might be expected to conceive within months, or else face rumors of barrenness. A peasant might be chastised by neighbors for not doing their duty if no baby appears by year's end. Historians still debate how frequently people had sex, how much they enjoyed it, and how much was forced. Diaries are rare. Letters are cautious. What survives are mostly laws, sermons and records of what should have happened, less often what did. But now, here you are, in a room that smells like beeswax, damp wool, and roasted onion. Your spouse exhales. You both shift under the covers, trying to figure out how this ancient ritual begins. And somewhere outside, someone coughs. Loudly. So much for privacy. Still, the candle flickers. The bed creaks, and slowly, uncertainly, the night unfolds. The candle sputters in the corner. You're lying in bed, face flushed, every muscle tense, not because of anything going on under the covers, but because there's an audience outside your door. That's right. The wedding night might be your private moment, but not in medieval terms. In many places, it was treated like a public event, with friends, family, clergy, and sometimes even legal authorities gathered just outside, listening for the telltale creak of bed slats or waiting for a servant to emerge with the stained linen sheet. You think back to earlier that evening. The feast was lively, sure, roasted meats, plenty of ale, laughter echoing off the stone walls, but there was an edge to it all. A shared understanding. The real entertainment starts after the toasts. And now, here you are, under those watchful, invisible eyes. In noble households, especially among royalty and high-ranking aristocrats, the consummation of the marriage was legally binding. No witnesses, no legitimacy. The couple might even be escorted to bed by guests, serenaded by musicians, or lightly teased with increasingly unsubtle songs. It was called bedding the bride, and if that sounds awkward, it was. Once the couple entered the chamber, the door would be closed but not entirely private. Some accounts describe onlookers remaining in the room until the couple was in bed. Others recall the bed curtain ritual, where the bed's heavy fabric enclosure was drawn, symbolizing the transition from public ceremony to private union. But don't expect them to leave quietly. The atmosphere was often loud, raucous, and full of half-drunken encouragement. You pull the covers up to your chin and glance at your new spouse. They're just as nervous, maybe more. Somewhere beyond the heavy wooden door you hear a cough, a chuckle, and the unmistakable clink of mugs. They're waiting. It gets worse. In some noble houses, a steward or trusted matron was responsible for retrieving the post-coital bed linens, stained with blood ideally, to prove virginity, and displaying them the next day. These linens might be paraded through the village, pinned to clotheslines, or presented to legal officials if land or dowries were at stake. Historians still argue whether this was truly common practice or exaggerated in retellings, but multiple regions across Europe kept records of proof of virginity customs, some of which lasted into the early modern period. Whether the stains were real or fabricated, well, that's another debate entirely. You turn to your spouse and whisper, "Do you think we have to?" They shake their head. Maybe just lie still for a bit. Make the bed creak. One fringe tale from 14th century Provence tells of a bride who, too nervous to go through with it, poured pig's blood on the sheet and faked sleep. Her new husband, terrified of her boldness, later confessed to the local priest that he'd married a witch with command of night illusions. You hear the wind outside. A chair scrapes. Are they still out there? This kind of public-private hybrid ritual was about more than nosiness. It was about control. The church wanted marriages to be monogamous, legitimate, fertile, and verifiable. The nobility wanted inheritances to be secure, heirs indisputable. And the village? The village wanted something to talk about. In smaller towns, there was another custom called charrevie, a raucous, noisy parade outside the couple's home meant to celebrate, or mock, their union. Pans were banged. Horns were blown. Jokes were shouted. Sometimes, if the couple was mismatched in age or wealth, the charrevie turned from teasing to cruel. The idea? Keep people in line, reinforce the norms, and embarrass anyone who thought marriage could be just for love. You shift again under the blanket. The mattress squeaks, not helpfully, and the candle gives one last flicker before going out entirely. It's dark now, and the crowd has quieted. Finally, a little silence. You wonder if the ritual is over, if they've gone back to drinking and gossiping. Maybe they've assumed the best. Maybe they're placing bets on how long you'll last. Maybe you'll hear about it in the market square tomorrow, disguised as concern. Meanwhile, if you're a peasant, your wedding night may be slightly less formal, but not necessarily less observed. In some rural communities, it was customary for friends or family to escort you to the bed and even tuck you in with teasing blessings and bawdy songs. If you're lucky, they'll leave quickly. If not, they'll linger for a while. Maybe comment on your nightshirt. Privacy, as a concept, simply wasn't what it is today. Sleeping, eating, childbirth, dying, it all happened within the shared space of the household. You're used to being watched, overheard, interrupted. So even now, as you lie quietly beside someone you barely know, trying not to think too hard about what's expected of you, part of you is just hoping no one barges in with more instructions. You whisper again. Should we do anything? A pause. I think if we just snore convincingly, we can buy ourselves time. It's not a bad plan. The bed creaks once more. Maybe that's enough. Maybe that's all they needed. Eventually, you doze off, still half-dressed, half-aware, half hoping no one bursts in with a lamp and a towel. The wind howls softly through the cracks in the shutters, and outside, a few final voices drift down the hall, slowly fading. Tomorrow, there'll be talk. But tonight, you survived, somehow. Morning comes too soon. The fire's gone out, your back aches from the rope bed, and your mouth tastes faintly of dried apple and stress. You sit up slowly, trying to gauge whether anyone is still lurking near the door. It's quiet now, eerily so. Maybe they've moved on. Maybe they're busy talking about what did or didn't happen in this bed. But you're not thinking about that anymore. You're thinking about the rules. Because even if you did everything right last night, got married, climbed into bed, maybe faked a creak or two, you still might have broken the church's rules without knowing it. See, in the medieval world, sex wasn't just a private act. It was a heavily regulated spiritual contract. The church had strong feelings about when, where, why, and how people could engage in it. And, by strong feelings, I mean hundreds of pages of stern Latin warnings. You stretch, yawn, and recall something the parish priest said during premarital counseling, which was really just a long sermon about sin and the importance of not enjoying yourself too much. Because yes, pleasure, even in marriage, was a slippery slope. Here's how it breaks down. Only within marriage? Approved. Only for procreation? Strongly preferred. Only certain days of the week? Absolutely. Only in certain positions? You bet. Enjoying it too much? Questionable. You look over at your spouse, who is clearly thinking the same thing. Wait, did we do it wrong by accident? The church calendar was packed with forbidden days. Advent? No. Lent? Definitely not. Fridays? Off limits. Feast days? Be respectful. Sundays? That's for prayer. Wednesdays? Well, debatable. Depending on the region, almost half the year could be considered unsuitable for intimacy. Historians still argue whether these restrictions were actually followed by most people or simply written down for appearances. But church authorities certainly wanted people to take them seriously, and in some cases, they enforced them. Confessors were trained to ask very specific, very awkward questions. When? How? With whom? Were you thinking holy thoughts? Did you enjoy it? You flop back onto the pillow with a groan. You barely know how to tie your new spouse's belt knots, let alone navigate a labyrinth of ecclesiastical prohibitions. Then there were the rules about positions. One fringe but infamous medieval penitential manual laid it out with theological clarity. Missionary was holy, everything else was animal-like, and thus potentially sinful. And no, there was no page 2 with diagrams or exceptions. So if, say, you got creative, or followed a tip from a cheeky aunt during the wedding feast, that might earn you a lecture at your next confession, or at least a few extra prayers. You sigh. You're not even sure what you did last night counted, much less whether it was canonical. One particularly stern bishop wrote that thinking lustful thoughts during marital relations could taint the entire act. It was like getting half credit on your spiritual report card. Do the deed? Fine. Think about it too much. Now we've got a problem. It all circles back to the church's vision of ideal sex: controlled, dutiful, impersonal, procreative. A means to an end, and preferably over quickly. You rub your eyes and wonder how many married couples just didn't bother asking. Or better yet, ignored the rules altogether. Some surely did. The laws may have existed, but enforcement varied wildly. In some areas you could be fined or made to perform public penance. In others, it was all winked away with a muttered prayer and a strong ale. Still, for those who tried to follow the rules, the anxiety was real. Medieval manuals listed specific, sinful combinations of days and acts, like a very grim board game. Try not to. Lie with your spouse during Lent. Think of someone else while doing so. Interrupt a religious fast with, passion. Laugh afterward. Yes, this one appears in a record. You try not to laugh now, but it bubbles up anyway. It's all so absurdly detailed. But then there were the loopholes. Some people argued that intent mattered most. If you truly meant to conceive, then everything else, timing, position, even occasional enjoyment, could be spiritually acceptable. Others pushed for a more nuanced take, suggesting that marital affection wasn't inherently sinful. A few brave theologians even defended the idea that mutual desire within marriage might be acceptable. Imagine that. And then there were those who simply didn't care. You remember the merchant's wife down the lane? Sharp tongue, sharper eyes. She once joked that the only commandment she followed in bed was, "Don't wake the baby." And judging by the number of babies she had, her bedtime schedule wasn't exactly Lent-friendly. In brothels, which we'll get to soon, these rules weren't just ignored, they were often mocked. Caricatures and dirty ballads circulated among the lower classes, poking fun at clerics who preached restraint while secretly slipping into tavern beds after dark. You roll over and stare at the cracked ceiling. The candle stub sputters. You're married. Officially. Legally. Spiritually. And maybe guiltily. But you survived the wedding. You survived the bedding. And if you accidentally broke 6 or 7 church laws, well, confession is always an option. Or you could just blame the full moon. For now, you pull the covers up again. You're newlywed, still confused, probably already in violation of ecclesiastical protocol, and completely, utterly exhausted. At least it's not Lent. The candle is finally out. Only moonlight filters through the slats of the shutter, casting pale stripes across the floor. You'd think this would be the moment for closeness, warmth, maybe even some genuine affection. But instead, you're being watched. Not by your neighbors this time, not by the steward. No distant coughs or giggling maidservants behind the door. This gaze is silent, stern, and coming from every corner of the room. Because tonight, as you huddle with your new spouse beneath a heavy woolen coverlet, your bedroom is full of saints, statues, icons, holy paintings, maybe even a relic or two, a bone, a scrap of fabric, a glass vial of something red. They watch with unblinking eyes from high shelves and dark alcoves. Their wooden faces are worn but serious, and you can't help but feel judged. Because in medieval homes, especially among the devout, God was always watching. Literally. It's not just saints, either. Maybe there's a small altar in the corner, set up by your grandmother when she moved in. Maybe your mother hung a rosary above the bed. Maybe there's a crucifix nailed to the wall directly opposite your pillow. Which means every time you open your eyes, Christ is staring directly at you. And that's a tough vibe to relax under. This wasn't unusual. Medieval households, rich and poor alike, commonly kept devotional items in shared living spaces. Bedrooms weren't just for sleeping or intimacy. They were for praying, healing, giving birth, dying. The sacred and the domestic were blended, which meant your bed wasn't just a bed. It was a platform for salvation, confession, and occasionally sheep fleeces. You glance across the room and spot a painting of the Virgin Mary. It's crooked. Her eyes seem particularly disappointed tonight. One fringe detail from a 15th century English household inventory notes that a family kept over 24 religious objects in their bedroom, including candles blessed at Candlemas and a small shrine containing a splinter from a saint's walking stick. Another family had a relic that they insisted protected them from sinful dreaming. Good luck with that. You shift slightly, mindful of the creaky mattress. The noise echoes. One of the icons tilts slightly on its nail. And just when you think the pressure's peaked, there's another layer of awkward. Someone is probably sleeping in the same room. Privacy was scarce in medieval life. Extended families often lived in a single-room cottage or in adjacent sleeping areas. That means, tonight, someone else, a cousin, a parent, a servant, is less than 10 feet away, probably pretending to be asleep and very much hearing everything. You and your spouse try not to breathe too loud. Upper-class homes sometimes had separate chambers, but even then, attendants or companions often slept in the same space. Young brides were rarely left alone for their first nights. There might be a maid sitting quietly in a corner or a mother-in-law parked by the hearth for support. Support. Right. In fact, some noble marriages were required to have witnesses inside the room for the first night. not just to verify consummation, but to act as moral chaperones. You try not to think about that as you tug the blanket up to your nose. Historians still argue whether most couples actually minded. Some probably didn't know any other way. But it's hard to imagine that warm, relaxed intimacy could bloom when you're trying to make a marriage work with Saint Jerome, judging you from the mantle and your aunt asleep by your feet. And speaking of intimacy, there's the issue of talking about it. You don't. Not really. Not in detail. Affection is something shown through duty, bringing a warm cup, fixing a hem, walking someone to market. You've never had a deep conversation about desire, or comfort, or preferences. Those words? Too modern, too dangerous, too close to lust. So when you lie beside your spouse, knees awkwardly brushing beneath the coverlet, the silence stretches. You don't know what to say. You're not sure if you're allowed to say anything. And part of you is too busy trying to remember whether Saint Anthony is the patron saint of lost souls, or the one who punishes marital excess. One quirky anecdote from a northern monastery tells of a lay brother who snuck into town, bought a wooden carving of a saint, and installed it above his bed for spiritual comfort. He later confessed he did it to stop himself from dreaming about a local brewer's daughter. He claimed it worked. Historians suspect otherwise. Back in your room, the fire has gone out again. You can feel your spouse's slow, steady breathing. They're asleep, or pretending to be. You listen for your sister's snore from across the room. She's quiet tonight, which is unsettling in its own way. The saints remain. You close your eyes and try to ignore the presence of 100 wooden gazes. You remind yourself that you've followed the rules. You're married. You prayed. You avoided eye contact with the relic on the shelf. And yet, you can't shake the sense that every sigh, every shift of fabric, every moment of closeness is being measured, judged, weighed on a scale between sacred and sinful. Still, the night deepens. And eventually, sleep finds you, not through comfort, but exhaustion. The saints blink slower. The air grows heavy, and even the Virgin's disappointment fades into darkness. You dream of silence, of empty rooms, of finally being alone. It's peaceful. Until the rooster crows. The rooster's call splits the silence like a church bell rung by someone holding a grudge. You wince, roll over, and immediately realize you're still tangled in the same itchy wool blanket, still wearing half your wedding clothes, and still sharing a bed with someone who now feels slightly more familiar, and yet still a mystery. But before you can untangle yourself, or even stretch properly, reality hits you again. It's freezing. You burrow deeper under the blanket, unwilling to face the world, and then it dawns on you. Again, you're expected to do this regularly. The marital act. And you're expected to do it under these exact conditions: scratchy fabric, shared beds, zero privacy, and clothes that never fully come off. Because in the medieval world, getting naked wasn't required for intimacy. In fact, it was often discouraged. There's no central heating. The fire's long since died out. The stone walls radiate cold, like they're trying to punish you for something. So why on earth would you strip down? You probably didn't. Instead, you both sleep, and sometimes do far more than sleep, in night clothes. Think long linen shirts, sometimes woolen hose, or even full-day garments reused for warmth. The idea of slipping into something more comfortable, that's a concept still centuries away. What you have instead is something far more practical and far less flattering. In wealthier households, there were nightshirts with front and rear flaps, giving you access while maintaining warmth and a modest semblance of modesty. Not sexy, extremely efficient. You sit up now, trying to straighten your twisted shirt. The thing bunches in all the wrong places, and one of the ties has vanished into a mysterious fold you might never find again. Your spouse groans softly, curls into the blankets, and mutters something about frozen toes. It makes sense though, doesn't it? Clothing wasn't just for daytime. It was protection. From the cold, from the fleas, from the spiritual dangers of skin. Because yes, nakedness was viewed with deep suspicion. The church taught that the body was a vessel of temptation. The less uncovered, the better. You were born naked, but you were baptized in a robe, and married in layers, and buried fully clothed. Being nude. That was for saints in visionary ecstasies, or sinners caught in acts they shouldn't have committed. Historians still argue whether people actually followed these guidelines, or whether it was mostly a clerical ideal. But accounts from households, travelogues, and even brothel regulations suggest nudity was rare, even in bed. In some regions, even married couples were advised not to gaze too long at each other's bodies. Modesty, restraint, and appropriate darkness were all seen as virtues. Some confessional manuals warned that lingering looks could stir the soul into dangerous waters. Passion, after all, was slippery, especially when it involved feet. Don't ask. One fringe case from a southern German town tells of a man who was fined, not for adultery, but for being improperly unclothed in his own bedroom. A neighbor saw through the window. The man's response? "I was just adjusting my stockings." The court disagreed. You pull your stocking back on now, struggling against the chill. Your toes are still numb. So is your sense of romance. But all of this, the staying dressed, the fumbling through layers, the careful coordination in tight spaces with low expectations, was just normal. For peasants, who might sleep 3 or 4 to a bed, fully clothed, under a single coarse blanket, there wasn't much room for anything resembling sensuality. If you got a moment of privacy, you took; if not, you made do. Quietly. In wealthier homes, there might be separate sleeping chambers, but servants still came and went. Fires had to be stoked, embers checked. Sometimes dogs were kept in the bed to stay warm. So if you managed any level of intimacy without being interrupted by a maid, a hound, or a suspicious mother-in-law, you were doing well. And then there was the smell. Let's not romanticize it. Bathing wasn't frequent. Bedding wasn't changed often. The mix of sweat, wool, tallow, stale air, and food odors created an environment that modern noses would revolt against. But in the Middle Ages, you didn't notice. You were used to it. You didn't worry about scented oils or clean sheets. You worried about not freezing to death. Still, affection found a way. In the dark, in the cold, through layers and silence and uncertainty. A shared touch, a whispered word, the brush of hands beneath too many layers. You learned to love sideways, diagonally, through fabric. A surprising number of courtship poems from the period describe touching through clothing, a hand on a sleeve, a kiss on a linen-covered shoulder. There's even a song in Old French where a lover describes sneaking his hand through the slit of his beloved's sleeve to feel her heart beat like a caged bird. It's oddly sweet, slightly creepy, very medieval. And then there's the symbolism. Being clothed during sex wasn't just practical, it was symbolic. A sign of humility, a rejection of pride. Saints were praised for rejecting carnal excess, and even married couples were encouraged to approach intimacy with covered hearts and guarded eyes. Which sounds poetic until you remember you're both just trying not to freeze or get a splinter from the bed frame. So you lie back down, now fully dressed once again. The light is growing outside. A rooster crows. The dog in the next room begins its morning whine. Somewhere downstairs, someone's already banging pans around. You reach for your spouse's hand beneath the blanket. They squeeze your fingers gently, a small gesture muffled by linen and wool. But in a world full of saints, rules, cold toes, and suspicious nightshirts, it feels like warmth. You shuffle down the narrow stairs later that morning, body stiff from the cold, and your nightshirt twisted under your tunic. A pot of something vaguely resembling porridge simmers on the hearth, and someone's already stoked the fire. You stretch, yawn, and are immediately met with your mother-in-law's raised eyebrow. She's not saying anything. She doesn't need to. Because in the Middle Ages, desire, especially marital desire, was always under surveillance. Not officially, perhaps, but socially, culturally, spiritually. You could be married, approved and fully sanctioned, and still considered suspicious if you were too into it. In fact, desire itself was framed as dangerous. You sit at the table and try to act normal, but you can feel it, that lingering, unspoken judgment that says, yes, you're allowed to do that, but must you enjoy it? The Church had plenty to say on the subject. Theologians and confessors debated how much pleasure was too much, and at what point desire became sinful, even inside a lawful marriage. The rule of thumb? Anything that made you forget yourself, lose your spiritual focus, drift too close to lust. That was where things got tricky. A particularly popular idea among medieval moralists was that sex should be tolerated, not enjoyed. It was a necessity. Like paying taxes, or emptying a chamber pot. You didn't have to like it. You just had to do it properly and without getting carried away. You sip your porridge. It's lukewarm and gritty. Fitting, honestly. Confessional manuals were filled with alarmingly specific questions for married couples. Had they desired their spouse too strongly? Had they rushed the act? Had they allowed their minds to wander to pleasure? Had they laughed afterward? Yes, laughing post-coitus was listed as a potential moral failing. You imagine telling a medieval confessor that you giggled a little afterward, and being met with a long silence and a list of psalms. Historians still debate whether these expectations were actually internalized by the average peasant couple. Some likely shrugged it off. Others confessed out of guilt. But for the deeply devout, and especially the educated clergy, desire was a shadowy force. One moment, a sacrament. The next, a sin. It didn't help that desire was often compared to fire, useful for warmth, but also capable of consuming everything if left unchecked. You could love your spouse, yes. You could feel drawn to them. But to yearn, to fantasize, to initiate things just because you wanted to, that was edging towards spiritual danger. This led to some absurd contradictions. You were expected to procreate, but not to want to. You had to prove your fertility, but never seemed too eager about it. If a couple had frequent relations, they might be praised for diligence or whispered about for indulgence. Even among married folk, too much affection could be seen as weakness. And if you thought women got the sharper end of the stick, you'd be correct. Desire in women was considered especially suspicious. The ideal medieval wife was obedient, quiet, and, above all, modest. If she showed signs of initiating affection, or even seemed too happy in her marriage bed, it raised eyebrows. Some texts describe such women as fiery, shameless, or untamed. One fringe anecdote from a 14th-century London confessor describes a wife who, during confession, admitted she enjoyed intimacy with her husband. The priest scolded her for loving the flesh too freely. Her penance? A week of fasting and sleeping on the floor. Her husband was never even mentioned. You spoon another mouthful of porridge into your mouth and wonder how many couples just pretended. Kept a straight face, acted like everything was routine and chaste and prayerful, even if it wasn't. And yet, desire refused to disappear. It bubbled up in art, poetry, songs whispered over market stalls, carvings hidden in the corners of cathedrals. Yes, cathedrals. If you ever get a chance to visit, look beneath the misericords, and you'll find all manner of inappropriate jokes carved into the wood. Naked figures, naughty animals, monks chasing women and being chased right back. Even the church couldn't completely suppress the basic fact that people are people, messy, curious, longing for connection. You remember a song your sister used to hum, a silly folk tune about a shepherd and a milkmaid under a cherry tree. Not scandalous exactly, but playful, with enough innuendo to make older listeners grin and younger ones blush. Desire didn't go away, it just went underground. Into riddles, into metaphors, into glances across a feast table or hands brushing near the bread basket. You learned to express it sideways, cloaked in humor, disguised as devotion. And sometimes, just sometimes, it broke free, in letters between separated spouses, in poetry exchanged secretly, in the way people looked at one another when they thought no one noticed. So you finish your porridge, stand up, and stretch again. Your spouse walks into the room, hair a little messy, smile sleepy. You catch their eye, and there it is, that flicker of something. A glimmer of closeness, a shared secret, the kind of look that would make your parish priest reach for holy water and a lengthy sermon. You keep the smile to yourself, because here, in a world of wooden saints, cold beds, and moral manuals, the length of small horses, desire still lives. Quietly, carefully, but persistently. And maybe, just maybe, that's enough. Later that day, you wander through the garden behind your home, or what passes for a garden, which is mostly weeds, a single stubborn cabbage, and some herbs in cracked clay pots. Your sister-in-law is out here too, hunched over a sprig of rue, muttering something under her breath. She glances at you, tucks a small pouch into her apron, and says nothing. You know better than to ask, because in the medieval world, contraception wasn't openly discussed, but it existed, and it was a strange, desperate, and sometimes poetic blend of herbs, charms, moon phases, prayers, and wild speculation. You crouch by the rosemary and pluck a leaf absent-mindedly, pretending you're not thinking about it. But of course you are. You're married now, and everyone knows what that means. Pregnancy. Probably soon. Probably often. Unless you chew your leaf slowly. You've heard the stories. Chewing parsley, sleeping with a small stone tied to your left thigh, wearing a wolf's tooth, timing things with the lunar cycle, avoiding moonlight on your belly. None of this is exactly scientific, but when you live in a world where even monks think sneezing could realign your humors, you try whatever you can. And the truth is, people did try. Contrary to modern assumptions, medieval people weren't ignorant about reproduction. Their ideas weren't modern, sure, but they understood cause and effect well enough to notice that certain behaviors seemed to delay pregnancies, and certain herbs had suspiciously consistent effects. Historians still argue whether these practices were widespread knowledge or passed privately between women, midwives, and healers. But plenty of medical and clerical texts reference substances used to close the womb or prevent quickening. You lean back against the garden wall and recall a passing comment from an older woman at the market. She'd said, while weighing turnips, that wild carrot boiled with wine kept babies away, if you drank it before the moon turned. You'd smiled politely at the time. Now you're wondering if you should have written it down. One fringe recipe from a 13th century medical compendium includes a mixture of dried mint, pennyroyal, and crushed bees to be consumed with wine and followed by vigorous walking. The side effects? Some dizziness, mild fever, and loose bowels. You hope that's all it did. And then there's coitus interruptus, known and practiced, even if not formally named. Church authorities condemned it as interfering with the divine purpose, but lay people likely had a more practical view. You suspect plenty of men claimed moral high ground when they were really just avoiding another hungry mouth to feed. Some attempts were mechanical. Linen plugs, herbal pastes, wax mixtures. One grimly inventive source suggests soaking a sponge in vinegar and using it as a barrier. You try not to imagine the sensation. Of course, none of these methods came with a guarantee or even consistent instructions. Success was variable. The church condemned most of it, and the line between herbal wisdom and dangerous magic was perilously thin. You glance at your sister-in-law again. She's grinding something now with a mortar and pestle, something green and bitter-smelling. She sees your look, raises an eyebrow, and shrugs. "It's just for cramps," she says. Then adds, with a smirk, "Cramps from what, though?" You laugh, but not too loudly. The walls have ears. The church, of course, considered any effort to block conception a moral failure. Even within marriage, every act was supposed to be open to life. Anything else was seen as selfish, or worse, rebellious. And yet, the records suggest otherwise. Midwives passed recipes quietly. Older women gave advice without blinking. Healers sold sachets under the table. Even clerics who condemned contraception often knew exactly what it was, and that fact alone is telling. Historians point to court records involving women accused of using potions, not always to end pregnancies, but to prevent them. There's even a case from rural France in which a woman admitted to burning dried juniper every new moon, then walking backward through her doorway to keep her womb light and closed. Did it work? Hard to say. But it worked often enough that someone told someone else, who told someone else, and here we are, chewing parsley like it's a prayer. The moon rises that evening. You sit by the hearth, staring into the embers, wondering if there's time to ask the midwife about rue, or whether such a question would land you in confession. Or worse, you're not even sure you want to avoid pregnancy. You just want a choice. A pause. A chance to feel like your body is yours, not a contract signed with every clink of a cup at your wedding feast. Your spouse joins you by the fire, places a hand gently on yours. No words, just warmth. There's something in that touch that says, "I understand." Or maybe, "I hope we're lucky." Or just, "Let's figure this out together." Outside, the wind carries the scent of herbs. Faint, sharp, intentional. And for the first time, you think, maybe there's a way to be wise in a world that thinks you're only supposed to be obedient. You fall asleep with mint on your breath and a pouch of crushed seeds under your pillow. Just in case. Morning light filters in through the cracks in the shutters, soft and gray. A rooster crows somewhere in the distance, again, and you already know before your feet touch the floor, you're pregnant. There's no test, no calendar, no book to check. But you feel it. That low buzz beneath your ribs, that aching tiredness that no stew or nap can shake. You feel different, not just in body, but in trajectory. Something has started. You sit on the edge of the bed, hand resting on your belly. It's flat, for now. But your body is not yours anymore. In the medieval world, pregnancy wasn't a surprise, it was an expectation. A woman's identity was often defined by how many children she bore, how quickly, and how healthily. Fertility was a virtue, a powerful one. But it came with risks, responsibilities, and no small amount of dread. Because it isn't just this pregnancy you're worried about, it's the next one. And the one after that. There's no birth control clinic, no recovery period. No discussion of spacing. You'll give birth, then heal, then most likely conceive again within months. Over and over, until your body gives out, your cycle shifts, or something goes wrong. Historians still argue whether women in the Middle Ages had any reliable way to control the number of children they had. But what is certain is this: most women bore many, often with very little time in between. Some noble women recorded 10, 12, even 15 births over the course of their lives. For peasants, records are scarcer, but gravesites tell the tale. Mothers buried young, often beside tiny swaddled forms. You rise slowly and wrap a shawl around your shoulders. Your joints already ache. You're not even showing yet. In some villages, pregnancy was met with celebration. Your neighbors might bring broth. A priest might offer a blessing. Older women might pull you aside with advice, useful or terrifying. But there was no hiding it. Once the signs showed, your belly became public property. People touched it, commented on it, prayed over it, wondered aloud if you'd have a boy or girl, although they always hoped for a boy. You'd hear theories about the shape, the way you walked, the tone of your skin. It's high, must be a girl. You're craving onions? Definitely a boy. All backed by firm confidence and zero evidence. You tie your apron slowly. It already feels snug. Medieval understanding of pregnancy was a mix of observation and guesswork. The humoral system dominated, meaning your health depended on the balance of blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. If you had nausea, it meant the baby was stirring your humors too much. If you felt cold, it meant your womb was contracting. Everything was interpreted through the lens of internal balance, and almost everything was blamed on the mother. One fringe belief suggested that a mother's emotions could mark the child. If you saw something frightening, your baby might be born with a twisted mouth. If you ate too many onions, their hair would grow wild. If you were angry too often, they'd be born red-faced and screaming. No pressure. You step outside and walk carefully over the uneven stones of the yard. Your sister-in-law, still not pregnant, still being asked why, waves lazily from the herb patch. Even miscarriages and stillbirths weren't spoken of as they are now. They were common. Devastating, yes, but not always given space to grieve. Sometimes it was chalked up to sin, or imbalance, or a failure of faith. You learned to move on quickly, quietly, with strength and a tight jaw. And then there was childbirth itself, a terrifying inevitability. Painful, dangerous, sometimes fatal. The idea of natural birth today sounds peaceful. Water tubs, gentle music. But in medieval Europe, natural meant you did it in your room, surrounded by other women, with no pain relief except prayers, warm cloths, and perhaps a bite of wood between your teeth. Midwives guided you. Saints were invoked. Birthing stools were used. And if things went badly, you were anointed early, just in case. One popular saint for the occasion was Saint Margaret of Antioch, who had once burst out of a dragon's belly and was now considered the go-to protector for women in labor. Small lead tokens with her image were worn during childbirth, clutched tightly in sweating fists. You reach into your pocket and find a small charm, just a scrap of fabric tied with a piece of twine. Your mother gave it to you. She said it kept her safe for 5 births, and that it failed on the 6th. Your spouse finds you by the fence later, gently guides you back inside. They ask nothing, just hold your hand, a small, simple thing, but comforting. Because in this world, the moment you're pregnant, you begin a countdown to the nausea, the cravings, the public belly, the quiet fears, the day of labor, the baby's first breath, if it comes. But you also begin something else, a bond with every other woman who's done this before. A silent sisterhood. Midwives, grandmothers, neighbors, saints. You are part of their rhythm now, and even if you don't speak of it out loud, you know you are brave. You are tired. You are already carrying more than just a child. You lie down early that night, hands on your stomach, already thinking of names, and wondering how many more you'll have to come up with before your hair goes gray. It's barely past dawn when the shouting starts. You sit up, clutching the blanket, half expecting bandits, fire, or another livestock escape. But it's just your neighbor, again, arguing with her husband in the middle of the lane. Words fly like chickens, sharp, frantic, full of fatigue. She's fed up. He's smug. And the village pretends not to notice. But you notice. Because you know what she's arguing about. She said no, and he said that's not allowed. Welcome to one of the most unspoken struggles in medieval marriage. Women who resisted. Who refused. Who said not tonight in a world that didn't think they had the right to. You lie back and stare at the rafters. The truth is, medieval women had few formal tools to control their own bodies within marriage. Marital consent, as we understand it now, didn't exist. The assumption was clear: sex was owed. A mutual debt. He gave her food, home, status. She gave him access. That was the deal. And yet, women still found ways to push back. Sometimes it was overt. A slammed door. A refusal to share a bed. A clever excuse, headache, stomachache, prayers that needed to be said. Sometimes it was more drastic: flight, abandonment, appeals to church courts. The records are full of women who resisted the marital bed, and many who were punished for it. One 14th century case in England tells of a woman who locked herself in the storage cellar for days to avoid her husband. He claimed she was withholding her wifely duties. She claimed he smelled of fish and wrath. The judge ordered them to reconcile. No one recorded how. Historians still argue whether women had any legal standing to say no. In theory, canon law emphasized mutual obligation. Both husband and wife owed each other the marital debt. That meant a wife could, technically, demand her husband's performance just as he could demand hers. But theory and practice were not the same. Especially when power, physical, social, legal, was so often on one side. You get dressed slowly. Your back aches again. Downstairs, your sister-in-law is muttering darkly about someone's cousin who ran off with a priest. You nod, thinking how often women turned to the convent, not out of devotion, but escape. Because while marriage was the expected path, some chose celibacy as a shield. The church, ironically, offered more bodily autonomy to nuns than to wives. Once cloistered, a woman could control her space, her schedule, even her diet to some extent. She no longer had to fear pregnancy. She no longer had to submit. There were women who made mystical claims, who said Christ was their bridegroom, who refused any mortal man, women who claimed visions, ecstasies, divine fire. They frightened bishops and confounded doctors. But they carved out space for themselves, and many were respected, eventually. You pour water into the basin and wash your face. The cold bite stings your skin, but it wakes you. You think of your own grandmother. She'd had 11 children, a crooked back, and a dry, biting sense of humor. When asked once about her marital obligations, she supposedly replied, "He owed me peace and quiet. I never got it." A rebellion, in its way. Then there were women who resisted without leaving, who stayed in the marriage, bore the children, kept the house, and still found subtle ways to reclaim themselves. One fringe tale tells of a woman in Italy who trained herself to snore so convincingly that her husband thought she was in deep sleep every night. She maintained the act for years. Whether it's true or not, it circulated in storybooks for centuries. A sleepy legend. Some women turned to rituals, wearing charms, whispering certain prayers, tying knots in their aprons to confuse the marital spirit. The church condemned these as superstition, but they persisted. And then there were those who refused quietly, who endured the guilt, the pressure, the lectures, and still chose to withhold, to reclaim at least part of their nights. You can't help but wonder how many women, across centuries, lay in the dark and whispered, not tonight, to a world that insisted otherwise. There's a moment of stillness after breakfast. You and your spouse share a glance across the table. Nothing is said aloud, but there's understanding in the quiet. Respect. A sense that perhaps this marriage will be different, or at least gentler. Not every husband was cruel. Not every wife had to hide her resistance. There were marriages built on affection, compromise, and tenderness, even in an age of obligation. They're just harder to find in the records, which tend to record the loud, the scandalous, the failed. But they existed. So did the women who fought, openly or silently, for their right to rest, to refuse, to choose. Their names don't always survive, but their echoes do. That afternoon, the neighbor's shouting fades. A door slams. The village exhales. For now, and you, still tired, still sore, still navigating this tightrope of duty, and will feel a little less alone. Because even in the Middle Ages, even with saints on the shelves and expectations in the sheets, some women still found the power to say no. And that, in its quiet way, is a kind of freedom. The sun sinks behind the thatched roofs of the village, casting long orange shadows over muddy lanes and wooden beams. You should be heading to bed soon, but there's something in the air tonight, an energy, a murmur, a ripple of curiosity that pulls you out past curfew. Because just beyond the baker's shop, tucked behind the tanner's barn, you hear laughter. Music. The sound of someone very clearly being slapped, but in a way that somehow still sounds like flirting. And you know exactly where that leads. Tonight, you're sneaking a peek at the place nobody mentions in church but everybody knows about, the brothel. And don't let the modern connotation fool you. Medieval brothels weren't all velvet and candles. More often than not, they were cramped, smelly, loud, and dangerously close to collapsing. But they were also regulated, taxed, and surprisingly tolerated by city authorities. You creep closer, careful to stay in shadow. A woman leans out of a second-floor window, adjusts her headscarf, and waves at someone in the alley. Her laugh is husky, her expression bored. She's done this before. You're not here to judge. You're here to understand. Because in the Middle Ages, sex work wasn't always hidden. It was often woven right into the structure of urban life. In cities like London, Paris, and Florence, brothels were licensed businesses. Their workers were registered, their earnings taxed, and their customers drawn from every social rank. Historians still debate whether this regulation helped protect women or simply made it easier to control them. Some brothels were managed by women. Others were run by male landlords, or more alarmingly, by local officials. You'd find brothels near markets, ports, even close to universities. Convenient, if nothing else. Inside, you'd smell a mixture of ale, cheap perfume, and disappointment. The walls would be damp, the furniture rickety, but there might be music, jokes, the occasional dog, and for some men, it was the only place they could ask for what they wanted, without confession afterward. Some sex workers wore specific colors, yellow hoods in London, striped gowns in parts of Italy, meant to mark them out. A woman in a yellow veil walking through the streets might get snickers, might get business, but she certainly wouldn't get invited to a wedding. Still, she worked. She earned. And in some cities, she had more economic autonomy than many wives. One fringe record from Cologne tells of a madam who used her brothel profits to fund a church roof repair. The priest accepted the donation, then claimed he didn't know where it came from. Everyone else knew. No one cared. You lean against the barn wall and hear a group of students stumble out of the front door, singing a tune with lyrics that would give a bishop chest pains. They laugh, spit, argue about who paid more, then wander off toward the tavern. Not everyone in town visits, but many do. You think about the women inside. Some may have chosen this life for survival. Others may have been coerced or trapped by debt. Some may have preferred it to marriage. For all its dangers, sex work offered something unusual in the medieval world. A wage in your own hand. No husband required. Still, the risks were immense. Disease, violence, social scorn. A woman could be fined, beaten, or worse for stepping out of line, even if her work was legal. And the double standard? Blinding. Men who visited brothels were rarely shamed. In fact, it was seen as a way to keep them from bothering respectable women. The church even entertained the idea that prostitution was a necessary evil. Better a man visit a brothel than seduce a merchant's daughter. Sex workers were, in this twisted logic, performing a public service, just not one anyone wanted to acknowledge publicly. You think about the tension of it all. The way a town could both rely on and revile these women. How they could be the object of both desire and disgust. And how, despite it all, they kept working. There's a common carving in medieval margins of manuscripts, tiny doodles made by bored scribes, showing a nun chasing a prostitute with a spoon. No explanation, no caption, just a nun. A woman in a striped dress, a spoon. It's funny. It's confusing. It's probably how a lot of people felt at the time. You inch away from the alley as the music quiets. A cat darts across the path. Somewhere, someone is singing again, off-key and loudly, about a fishmonger's wife. As you walk home, you think about how layers of society stacked strangely in medieval towns. Monks next to brothels, butchers next to scribes. Morality walking hand in hand with hypocrisy. And you think about the women who stood in the doorway with their tired smiles and sarcastic eyes. Women who knew the rules better than the bishops and had long since stopped pretending to follow them. Maybe tomorrow one will sneak into church and sit at the back. Maybe one will leave town, start over. Maybe one will run her business until she's old enough to pass it on to a niece with sharper elbows and a quicker wit. Because in a world where love was prescribed, marriage was mandatory, and pleasure was policed, brothels were a loophole. And the women inside them, survivors. You wake to the sound of chanting, not from the street, not from your neighbor's goat, but from the little stone church just up the hill. Low, echoing Latin flows through the fog like incense, settling into the morning like a spiritual foghorn. You pull on your cloak and peer out the window. A friar walks past, face hidden under a hood, hands tucked into sleeves. And you think, he probably knows more about sex than he's supposed to. Because here's the truth that makes your village priest uncomfortable. Not all clergy was celibate. Not even close. Despite official vows, written rules, and the looming specter of eternal damnation, clergy in the Middle Ages regularly bent, dodged, or outright ignored the church's expectations of chastity. And people knew it. You finish dressing and head to the well for water. The baker's apprentice is already there, gossiping, loudly, about how Father Alain has been visiting the fishmonger's daughter far too often. For confession, he says, then snorts. Sure, you pretend not to listen, but you are absolutely listening. The medieval church officially demanded celibacy from priests starting in the 12th century. But enforcement, patchy at best, especially in rural areas where the nearest bishop might be 3 days' ride away and far too busy with politics to care who Father Alain was visiting after Vespers. Some priests had housekeepers who just happened to stay overnight. Others fathered children, referred to delicately in records as nephews or godsons. The locals knew. They always knew. Historians still argue whether this was tolerated out of genuine indifference or pragmatic realism. After all, priests were needed. If you excommunicated every priest with a mistress, half the churches would fall silent overnight. You lower the bucket into the well and think of one particular story, a bishop who, in a moment of rare honesty, told a council that if they punished every priest for fornication, there would be none left to say Mass. It wasn't just the lower clergy either. Abbots, canons, even bishops got caught. The Pope himself had to issue repeated warnings about concubined clergy. And yet, the problem persisted. Or, depending on your view, simply reflected human nature. In some cities, priests were expected to tithe a fine each year for moral lapses. It was so routine that it became part of the accounting system, a built-in sin fee. But the Church, ever anxious about appearances, drew a line between private sin and public scandal. If your affair was discreet, a few Hail Marys and a silver coin. If it became public, that's when things got messy. One fringe case from Bohemia tells of a priest who openly lived with 2 women and had 6 children. He was summoned to explain himself and replied, "Which one do you mean?" Legend says the bishop just sighed and sent him home with a letter reminding him to try harder. You pass by the church now, the chanting fading behind you. The priest is out front, tending to a rosebush. He nods politely. You nod back, pretending not to remember the gossip. But part of you wonders what it must feel like to take vows you never intended to keep. To preach purity while stealing kisses behind the altar. To hear confessions on Sunday and break the same rules on Monday. And still, the clergy weren't all hypocrites. Some genuinely tried, struggled, fasted, flagellated themselves to quell desire, slept on wooden boards, refused to look women in the eye. They wrote tortured poems and scribbled warnings in the margins of prayer books. Flee lust, flee the devil in soft hands. Others just made peace with their contradictions. They were human, after all. No amount of incense or Latin chanting could smother that. You recall a carving you once saw in the monastery gatehouse, a monk clinging to a tree, trying to resist a woman offering him a pie. Beneath it, the words, "Even the holiest fall for sweetness." Literal or metaphorical, hard to tell, but funny either way. Even the saints struggled. St. Augustine famously prayed, "Lord, grant me chastity, but not yet." A line that still feels suspiciously modern. You wonder, too, about the women involved. The ones who loved a priest, who risked reputation and damnation, who waited in shadows, who left children unnamed. Some may have been exploited. Others may have gone in with open eyes. Love, after all, doesn't always follow the rules, especially when the rules are written by celibate men in tall hats. The fishmonger's daughter passes you on the path, basket swinging at her hip. She doesn't look at you, but you notice the faint smile tugging at the edge of her mouth. And suddenly, you realize, maybe the gossip isn't entirely cruel. Maybe it's just the village's way of handling the truth. That desire doesn't stop at the church door. That robes don't make someone immune. That faith and flesh have always shared a complicated relationship. You walk home slowly, sunlight warming your shoulders. Inside, your spouse is stirring something at the hearth. You sit beside them, silent for a while, and you think, in a world where even those sworn to celibacy can't resist a glance, a touch, a lingering goodbye, maybe we're not meant to be perfect, just honest. That night, as you lie beneath the scratchy wool blanket, listening to the house creak in its joints, you hear something even more unsettling than the usual mice under the floorboards or the soft snores from the next bed over. It's your own mind whispering, "What if you're doing it wrong? Not marriage, not sleeping." The other thing, because medieval people, contrary to popular myth, were very concerned about doing it correctly, and by correctly, we mean everything from position to intent, to whether or not Tuesday was a spiritually risky time for intimacy. Yes, Tuesday. You shift slightly in bed, suddenly hyper-aware of everything, from the direction you're facing to how close your knees are to your spouse. Because this wasn't just about love, or desire, or even reproduction. This was about rules, and there were a lot of them. You may not have access to a university library, but you've definitely heard whispers about what's allowed and what's not. The village priest preaches about it indirectly. The midwife mumbles warnings during postnatal visits, and someone's cousin's uncle got caught doing something upside down and had to fast for a month. The correct position, according to most medieval clerics, was, well, pretty boring. The missionary position, husband on top, facing each other, was considered not only the natural way, but the only morally acceptable way. Anything else veered dangerously close to sin. And no, this wasn't just idle chatter. There were actual confessional manuals that detailed each position and assigned levels of sinfulness. Like a kind of spiritual gymnastics guide, but with a lot more shame. One fringe example from a 14th century Flemish manual labels any position other than missionary as lustful contortion, and claims it attracts demons of confusion. You try to picture what a demon of confusion looks like, and briefly imagine a creature with 3 elbows, holding a moral rule book and looking deeply disappointed in you. Historians still argue whether people took these rules seriously or just nodded in church and then did what they liked behind closed doors. But the fact remains, people were told there was a right and wrong way to love, and deviation came with consequences, not just spiritual, but sometimes social. Rumors could spread. She lets him kiss her shoulders. They face the wall when they lie together. He let her sit on his lap during Lent. Scandalous. And then there was timing. Medieval calendars weren't just for farming. They were full of forbidden days. Feast days, fast days, saint days, Sundays, Fridays, Wednesdays, entire swathes of the year were considered off-limits for intimacy. Add it up, and depending on how strictly you followed the rules, you had maybe 90 safe days a year. That's not a lot of time to maintain a healthy relationship and avoid eternal damnation. You remember your neighbor, a thin-lipped widow, who once claimed that her husband only ever touched her on approved Saturdays. They had 2 children in 12 years. She seemed satisfied with the ratio. There was even debate over times of day. Night was preferred, less distracting, more modest, but some confessional manuals warned against morning intimacy because it made the soul drowsy with desire all day. As if chores weren't already exhausting enough. You roll onto your side, facing the wall, trying not to think about all the impossible combinations of sin and posture. But the rules didn't stop there. The church also warned against being overly affectionate during the act, kissing too much, talking too softly, laughing, especially laughing. There's a recorded penance for a man who admitted that he and his wife made jokes during intercourse. His priest prescribed a month of silence and no meat. No clarification on whether poultry counted. Yet despite the flood of restrictions, human nature did what it does. People still found ways to be close, to explore, to learn each other. There's a quiet resistance in every whispered joke under the sheets, in every stolen glance before dawn. You recall a scrap of manuscript you once saw at the market, its edge burned, text half missing, but the part that remained read, and in the warmth of the bed, they forgot the fear of sin. You've always wondered if it was meant as a warning or a blessing. In some towns, folklore and superstition also crept in, muddying the waters further. Lying on the left side of the bed was supposed to produce girls. Facing north was believed to increase fertility. If you left your shoes pointing inward by mistake, it might make your child cross-eyed. One legend said that if you made love under a full moon, your baby would be born with a song in their heart. You kind of hope that one's true. One particularly odd belief from a German village suggested that sprinkling crushed mint on the sheets tamed carnal fires. You assume someone tried it, got very minty, and went right back to the original plan. Despite the endless regulations, despite the sermons and manuals and sidelong glances, people made it work. They found what felt right between them. Or they didn't, and quietly resented the rules that told them their love was wrong. You turn once more and reach for your spouse's hand. The blanket shifts. No saints are watching tonight, at least none that you can see. And maybe tomorrow's a forbidden day. And maybe, just maybe, you don't care. Because sometimes, against all odds, in a world built on control and caution, you remember that love is not a sin. And laughter in the dark is worth more than a dozen perfect prayers said from the cold side of the bed. The morning fog clings low to the ground as you open the shutters. Out in the village, children chase a goose through muddy puddles, and a cart loaded with hay creaks past your window, shedding straw like breadcrumbs. Life continues, quiet, repetitive, and utterly indifferent to the vast tangle of questions still turning in your mind. You dress slowly, because today you're heading to the bathhouse. And not just to wash, because while medieval people weren't known for their hygiene, at least by modern standards, they did bathe. And not always alone. Not always modestly. And not always platonically. If you'd lived in a city, the bathhouse would be a regular part of life. Communal, steamy, and weirdly social. Imagine a public sauna crossed with a tavern, a bit of a spa, and maybe, depending on the clientele, a flirtatious tavern brawl with less clothing. You tug your cloak tighter and head toward the town edge, where the old bathhouse sits like a crumbling memory of Roman efficiency. Steam curls out from the crooked roof. Someone's laughing inside. You step through the door, and it hits you. Not just the heat, but the noise, the dampness, the scent of herbs and sweat and wood smoke. Cloaks hang on pegs, buckets slosh. People chatter freely. This isn't just a place to scrub away the grime, it's a place to connect. Because in many parts of medieval Europe, especially cities like Paris, Prague, and Nuremberg, bathing was a shared, semi-public event. Men and women sometimes bathed together, naked or in light garments, often with food, sometimes with music, sometimes with wine, and yes, sometimes with other things. Bathhouse culture occupied a strange space, tolerated, regulated, and constantly monitored. Officials kept lists of who worked in them. Rules were posted and ignored. Some bathhouses offered services beyond rinsing, and everyone knew which ones they were. Historians still argue whether these steamy gatherings were primarily for hygiene or for social or sensual interaction. The truth is probably both. After all, In a world where your bedroom might contain 5 relatives, and your marriage was more obligation than affection, a bathhouse offered freedom, privacy, heat, slippery opportunity. You sit on the wooden bench and watch 2 women scrub each other's backs with bundles of thyme. Nearby, a pair of apprentices argue over who dropped the soap bucket. And at the far end of the pool, a couple speaks in low tones, foreheads nearly touching. It's not scandalous, it's everyday life. One fringe record from Nuremberg details a bathhouse known as the Swan, which had carved swan decorations, herbal bath menus, and small alcoves where couples could chat. The city tried to shut it down for being too pleasant. It reopened a month later with fewer swan carvings and a firmer door. You dip your toes in the water and instantly relax. Your muscles sigh. Someone hands you a wooden cup of cider. You thank them, wondering if it's safe, then drink it anyway. What's fascinating is that even though these places were sometimes condemned by moralists and church officials, they remained popular for centuries because people needed them, physically, socially, emotionally, and maybe also romantically. It wasn't unusual for bathhouses to be neutral spaces where relationships could bloom, outside the rigid expectations of class, gender roles, or marriage contracts. Here, you could speak freely, flirt, escape your label. One old poem tells of a woman who fell in love with a miller at the bathhouse. They met each week, never married, always returned to their lives afterward. But she called it the only place I remembered I was alive. Still, the bathhouse wasn't all warmth and wine. There were risks, disease, judgment, eavesdroppers, and the line between relaxation and impropriety was thin. So thin, in fact, that by the late medieval period, many cities began shutting down bathhouses altogether, not because people stopped using them, but because authorities worried too much about what they were doing in them. You finish your cider and slide fully into the water, your body grateful, your mind finally quiet. You think of the monks who wrote long tracts against bathing, because it stirred impure thoughts. You think of the women who worked in bathhouses, not always as sex workers, but often judged as if they were. You think of the laborers who saved a week's pay just to soak their aching bones for an hour on Sunday. And you think, maybe the bathhouse was never just about soap. It was about closeness, choice, release. When you step out, your skin is pink and wrinkled, and your hair smells faintly of lavender. The woman at the door hands you a clean linen to dry your hands. You nod your thanks and step into the cool evening air, feeling light, a little new. Because in a world that so often tangled love with duty, and desire with guilt, and marriage with silence, this steamy little room offered something different. Warmth, not just of water, but of being seen, of being touched kindly, of remembering that your body is not just a vessel for children or penance, it is a source of joy. And sometimes, joy is revolutionary. The following week brings rain, soft at first, then endless. It slicks the rooftops, turns the roads to sludge, and soaks straight through your boots by midday. It also slows everything down. Market chatter turns into whispered haggling, deliveries get postponed, and more than one neighbor just gives up and stays inside with a pot of soup and a deck of well-worn cards. Which is exactly what you're doing, until someone mentions courtly love. You're gathered by the hearth, drying your sleeves, when your cousin begins reciting a bit of verse. It's flowery, full of longing, and almost definitely exaggerated. Something about a knight kneeling in the rain for 3 days, just to catch a glimpse of his lady's veil fluttering at a window. More likely he slipped in the mud and she laughed. Your sister-in-law mutters, and you all chuckle. But it gets you thinking, because in a world where most marriages were arranged, where affection came after alliance, if it came at all. What did love even mean? Enter courtly love, a peculiar, poetic, and wildly impractical invention of medieval upper classes. You lean back against the hearth wall as someone adds more kindling, and the room glows gold. You let your thoughts wander to castles and courtyards, troubadours and stolen glances, forbidden letters passed between fingers. Courtly love was a literary fantasy, born in the courts of southern France and spread across Europe like perfume spilled on silk. It wasn't about marriage, it was about yearning, longing for someone you couldn't have. Often someone else's wife, sometimes a queen, always someone out of reach. Historians still argue whether courtly love reflected actual behavior or simply served as an emotional escape hatch. After all, real-life marriages were often transactional. But in these songs and stories, love became sacred, unconsummated, idealized, eternal. Basically, medieval fan fiction. Knights pledged loyalty to their ladies with the same solemnity they gave their lords. They wrote poems about the curve of her wrist, the pain of not being noticed, the torment of catching a smile and wondering if it meant something. And the women? Oh, they played along, sometimes. A noblewoman might wear a knight's favor at a tournament, a scarf, a ribbon, a brooch. She might respond to his poems with veiled compliments, or she might ignore him entirely and go back to inspecting her tapestry of swans. Still, these relationships were codified. You had to play by the rules. There were actual treatises, like The Art of Courtly Love, that laid out who could love whom, how you should behave, and what counted as noble suffering. Too forward? Unchivalrous. Too cold? Cruel. Too passionate? Dangerous. Too indifferent? Well, then it wasn't love at all. One fringe case tells of a knight who fell in love with a merchant's daughter and declared it publicly in verse. She laughed. He wrote more. She continued laughing. Eventually, he joined a monastery. His poem survived. Her laughter didn't. You glance across the hearth at your spouse, not a knight, not a poet, but kind, solid, loyal. You think of your own feelings, built slowly, through laughter and labor, not longing and lute songs. And yet, you admit, there's something magnetic about that useless kind of love, the kind that exists only in words, in glances, in the sighs between syllables. Even peasants, far removed from the courts, caught wind of this movement. Ballads filtered down. Traveling entertainers adapted them for tavern crowds. Love stories were performed with puppets and flutes. The nobility had bards. You had bored cousins with good singing voices. Courtly love changed how people thought about love, even if their reality didn't change much. It introduced the idea that love could be transformative, tragic, uplifting. Even noblewomen stuck in political marriages might find comfort in imagining that somewhere, someone yearned for them in silence. But not everyone admired it. The church, predictably, worried that courtly love encouraged adultery, fantasy, and moral confusion. After all, if your heart belonged to a poetic knight, it might wander from your husband. And if a knight's passion burned too brightly, it might lead to more than metaphor. Still, the poems spread. The stories grew. And for a while, Europe fell in love with the idea of being in love. Not with their spouse, but with romantic suffering. You imagine a young nobleman composing verse about the lady who barely glanced at him, and a kitchen maid in the next room rolling her eyes while scrubbing a turnip. Real love is doing the laundry, she probably muttered. And she wasn't wrong. But sometimes, especially on a rainy day like this, with stew bubbling and your sleeves finally dry, It's okay to let your mind wander to the balcony where someone once sighed into the wind, clutching a love letter they'd never send. Because while the reality of medieval love was often muddy, itchy, and faintly cabbage-scented, the fantasy had silk edges. And we all need a bit of silk now and then. It's nearly dusk when the priest's bell tolls again, slower this time, gentler. The village begins to settle, goats tucked in, shutters latched, stew pots scraped clean. But in one dim cottage near the edge of town, a woman leans over a small cradle, her brow furrowed. The baby inside wails, red-faced and hungry, and the woman, barely more than a girl, doesn't know what to do. She isn't married, and the child's father, he's long gone. You pass by without staring, but the air is thick with judgment. Not from you, at least, not intentionally, but from the way the village breathes around her. Because in the Middle Ages, bearing a child outside of marriage was a weight heavier than the cradle itself. And yet, it happened. All the time. Despite all the rules, sermons, shame and consequences, people still loved imperfectly. Secretly. Unexpectedly. And sometimes they ended up with a baby and no ring, or no intention of one. These children were labeled illegitimate, a word that carried the weight of exclusion. Illegitimate children could not inherit, could not hold certain offices, and were sometimes forbidden from marrying well. And their mothers? They faced social exile, church penance, or worse. Historians still argue whether all unwed mothers were condemned equally. In villages, where everyone knew everyone else's chickens by name, there was often practical mercy. If the family helped, or if the child was quietly accepted into a household, gossip might fade. But in cities, the stakes were higher, the options narrower. Some women turned to foundling hospitals, charitable institutions where they could leave a baby anonymously. The child might be raised by nuns or passed into foster care. Some survived. Many didn't. One fringe tale tells of a midwife in Milan who left ribbon codes in the swaddling of abandoned babies, pink for mother still living, blue for orphaned, yellow if the baby had siblings elsewhere. No one knows how many people understood the system. But someone must have. You return home slowly, your boots heavy with evening mud. Your own household is quiet. The fire burns low. You think of your neighbors, your parents, the people who shaped their lives around rules, and those who broke them. Because here's the uncomfortable truth. Medieval people loved fiercely, foolishly, and often in defiance of every law they were told to follow. And sometimes that meant falling for the wrong person. Sometimes it meant trying to make it work when everything said it shouldn't. Adultery happened. Affairs bloomed. Women passed off children as their husbands with fingers crossed and prayers whispered. Some men raised children they suspected weren't theirs. Others didn't. The church had complicated feelings about all of it. They condemned fornication, yes, but also preached forgiveness. Confession could absolve a sinner, but not always repair a reputation. Punishments varied wildly. A nobleman might be quietly married off to a lesser cousin. A peasant girl might be forced to do public penance in a shift with her hair down, symbolizing shame. A man might pay a fine, or nothing. And yet, even with all that risk, people kept falling in love outside the lines. You think about the power of stories, about the songs sung at markets, the romances passed between hands in crumbling parchment, love stories that defied norms, lovers disguised as pilgrims, servants and lords, secret children of queens. They weren't always happy endings, but they were honest, complicated, human. Back in your home, you sit by the window, watching the candlelight flicker. Your spouse places a hand on your shoulder, silent, familiar. You lean into it. You remember everything you've seen, heard, lived. You remember the awkward courtships. the whispered rebellions, the marriages that were more like truce treaties, the longing that sometimes bloomed into kindness and sometimes didn't. You remember the rules, and the people who broke them, and you realize medieval intimacy wasn't a simple story of repression or indulgence. It was a story of negotiation, between expectation and desire, between faith and flesh, between what the world demanded and what the heart wanted. And in the margins of that story, the real lives, the stolen glances, the quiet compromises, the touch beneath the blanket on a night no one was watching. People loved, messily, desperately, hopefully. Just like now, you blow out the candle, but not before one last look out the window. The sky is violet now, and the last bell tolls, and you think, maybe the most medieval thing of all wasn't the shame, the penance, or even the rules, but the persistence of hope. Because even in the darkest corners of a cold, candlelit room, someone still reached out and whispered, "Stay." The fire has dwindled now, just gentle embers pulsing in the hearth. Outside, the rain has softened into a hush, a steady rhythm against the thatch that sounds almost like breathing. You lie still beneath your blanket, your body warm, your thoughts trailing into the quiet corners of everything you've heard tonight. The bed creaks slightly as you shift, not out of discomfort, but to find that perfect, still place where your limbs can melt into the mattress and your breath slows without effort. Your eyelids grow heavier with every flicker of the firelight. You think of candles guttering out in stone chambers, of cloisters tucked into hillsides, of lovers laughing behind closed shutters, of bathhouses fogged with steam and stories. You think of whispered prayers beside sleeping children, of midwives smoothing hair back from damp foreheads, of monks who once slipped through gardens in search of moonlight and touch. History is noisy when you wake it, but now it returns to silence. You've seen how rules were made and how hearts reshaped them. You've wandered past brothels and through abbeys, listened to gossip at the well and confessions in the dark. You've glimpsed moments of tenderness in the unlikeliest places. Because the truth of medieval intimacy isn't written in grand declarations or polished sermons, but in the quiet choices made beneath blankets, beside fires, in defiance, in devotion. Let that warmth hold you now. Let the past fold in around you like a soft cloak. You're safe here. Your breath deepens. Your thoughts soften. The stories settle into dreams. Tomorrow will come, with chores and chatter and cold feet on a stone floor. But for now, you rest. You are still. You are home.